Welcome to Urban Legends, and in tonight's video, we're journeying back to New England in the late 18th century, a world of harsh winters, hard living, and deadly disease. In these isolated rural communities, fear spread as quickly as illness, and whispers of the undead began to take hold. This is the story of the New England vampire panic. In the late 18th century, New England was a region shaped by scattered farming communities, demanding winters, and long stretches of rural quiet that defined everyday life. Across the countryside of Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Vermont, families lived on small homesteads surrounded by dense woodland, with neighbors often separated by long miles of rough tracks and fields. Most people worked the land, tended livestock, and relied on a close circle of relatives and nearby households, because travel was slow and the outside world felt very far away. It was also a time when illness posed a constant threat. Medical understanding had not yet caught up with the diseases that swept through these isolated towns, and tuberculosis, known then as consumption, was one of the most feared. The illness moved silently from person to person, causing a gradual weakening that people watched helplessly, as once strong family members grew thin and exhausted, often coughing up blood with no clear explanation. Reliable doctors were scarce, scientific information spread slowly, and many communities depended on whatever knowledge had been passed down through generations simply to make sense of what they were seeing. When several members of the same household fell sick one after another, it left families searching for answers with very few tools to understand what was happening. In these remote towns, shaped by hardship and limited information, fear and speculation could easily find a foothold. It was within this atmosphere that people began to look to the supernatural. The idea grew that someone who had already died might still trouble the living, draining their strength and causing them to become weak, and many people began to use the word vampire to describe this hidden threat. The vampire, in this New England sense, was not a creature of Gothic fiction, but a troubling presence within a family, a dead relative who was believed to be drawing life from those who remained. This belief formed out of a mixture of old customs and the very real desperation that followed repeated bouts of consumption. In small farming towns, the idea of a vampire offered an explanation that felt more grounded and understandable than anything doctors or ministers could provide. As talk of vampires spread from one community to the next, families began acting on these beliefs, and over time, several recorded cases appeared across the region. Some of the earliest known examples came from Vermont in the late 1780s, where families who had lost multiple relatives to consumption gathered with neighbors to examine the graves of their dead. Similar incidents appeared in Connecticut and Rhode Island during the early and mid-19th century, often following the same pattern of a family struck again and again by illness, a growing belief that something supernatural was at work, and a decision to look to the graves for answers. These events drew in whole communities because the fear of a vampire was not limited to one household. If a vampire was active, many believed it could spread its influence beyond a single family. When graves were opened, the condition of the body became the key to identifying a vampire. If the corpse appeared better preserved than expected, or if blood was found in the heart or other organs, many took this as solid proof that the dead person had become a vampire and was feeding on the living. People did not understand that cold soil, winter burial, and natural variation in decomposition could easily create these signs, so the conclusions they drew felt reasonable for the time. The discovery of blood in particular carried enormous weight, because it suggested to those watching that the dead still had some kind of life or energy that they should not possess. In an effort to stop the vampire's influence, families often followed a ritual that had been passed along by tradition and local memory. This usually involved removing the heart or other organs from the body and burning them, a symbolic act meant to break the link between the dead and the living. Sometimes the ashes were buried again, and sometimes they were mixed with liquid and given as a kind of remedy to the sick, a desperate attempt to fight an illness that no one understood. These early cases grew in number as the years passed, and they shaped the wider belief that vampires were a real and active danger in parts of New England, laying the groundwork for the panic that would spread through the region in the decades that followed. By the second half of the 19th century, the belief in vampires had spread so widely through parts of New England that it drew real attention from newspapers, ministers, and even medical men who were puzzled or disturbed by what they saw as a return to superstition. What had started as a handful of isolated cases in the countryside had grown into a recognized pattern, repeated again and again across Rhode Island, Connecticut, Vermont, and parts of Massachusetts. Families who faced repeated deaths from consumption often turned to the same desperate remedy, exhuming the bodies of their dead to see whether one among them might be a vampire. In most instances, these acts were carried out quietly, without outside interference, but as the century wore on and literacy increased, word of such events began to spread further, turning what had once been local fears into a wider panic that people across New England came to know about. Although dozens of cases were reported or remembered by local historians, one of the most widely recorded examples occurred in the small town of Exeter, Rhode Island, in 1892, involving a young woman named Mercy Brown. Her family had already lost her mother and sister to consumption, and when Mercy herself fell ill and died, neighbors persuaded her father to open the graves in search of the cause. Mercy's body, kept in cold storage through the winter, appeared unusually well preserved, and this was taken as a sign that she had become a vampire. Her heart and liver were removed and burned, and a mixture made from the ashes was given to her sick brother as a cure. His death shortly afterward marked not just the end of the family's tragedy but also one of the last known cases of such a ritual in the region. Mercy Brown's story was not unique. In Vermont, cases were reported as early as the 1790s and continued into the mid-19th century, and similar incidents were recorded in Connecticut and Maine. In each, the same cycle repeated. A family struck by a wasting disease, the spread of fear through the surrounding community, and the belief that only by confronting the vampire could the illness be stopped. By the time of Mercy Brown's exhumation, the idea had begun to fade under the weight of growing medical knowledge, but it still lived on in isolated pockets where old habits and traditions held strong. The panic itself reflected not only fear of the supernatural, but also the limits of understanding in a time when science and superstition often stood side by side, each trying in its own way to explain the mysteries of life and death. When examined today, the New England vampire panic seems less like a story of monsters, and more like a story of people trying to understand death in the only way they could. The so-called vampires were not the pale and faint figures that appear in books or films, but the imagined spirits of friends and family who had died of consumption and were believed to be feeding on those left behind. The sickness created every sign that seemed to confirm the vampire's presence, with the drained faces, the hollow eyes, and the faint bodies that wasted away no matter what was done. In this setting, the word vampire gave a name to the fear that people could see but not explain, and the rituals that followed were acts of hope against despair. No one ever claimed to see a vampire rise from the grave or walk at night, but many believed the signs of their work were all around them, written in the slow suffering of those who fell ill. As the 19th century went on, new knowledge began to push these old fears aside. Doctors and scientists started to understand that tuberculosis was spread by bacteria, not by the touch of the dead, and as germ theory reached rural communities, the idea of the vampire lost its hold. Newspapers began to treat the stories as curiosities rather than warnings, and ministers spoke openly against disturbing the dead. By the time the century drew to a close, the panic had faded, and the last known cases, including those in Rhode Island and Vermont, were remembered more with embarrassment than belief. Still, for the people who lived through them, the fear of vampires had been real and powerful, and it had shaped the way entire towns faced the mystery of disease and loss. The legend of the New England vampires did not vanish entirely. The stories continued to circulate in local memory, sometimes whispered as cautionary tales, sometimes retold as proof of how far people had come. Folklorists and writers later rediscovered these accounts, fascinated by the idea that communities in America had once believed in vampires of their own. Some scholars have even suggested that reports of these exhumations reached Europe in time to influence Bram Stoker as he researched Dracula, published in 1897, only a few years after the last recorded vampire case in New England. Whether or not Stoker drew directly from these events, the parallels are striking, and they show how easily stories of fear and survival can travel across oceans and generations. Today, the New England vampire panic stands as a reminder that belief in vampires was not confined to dark castles or distant legends, but once lived among ordinary people who faced death they could not control and tried to fight back against it in the only way they knew.